Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
I was terrified of public speaking when I was in high school and college. I couldn't do it. I mean, I'd throw up and everything. So I took this Dale Carnegie course, and as soon as I finished it, I was 20 years old. I went out to the University of Omaha, and I said, I want to start teaching because I wanted to get up in front of people and make sure I didn't lapse back. I actually had the diploma in the office, and I don't have my diploma from college. I don't have my diploma from graduate school, but I've got my Dale Carnegie diploma there because it changed my life.
My guest today is writer and researcher Jess McHugh. Her work has appeared across a variety of national and international publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Nation, Time, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Paris Review, Fortune, Village Voice, among many, many others. She has reported stories from 4 continents on a range of cultural and historical topics, from present-day Liverpool punks to the history of 1960s activists in Greenwich Village. Her most recent work is Americanon, an unexpected U.S. history in 13 best-selling books, and that will be our topic of discussion today. Of Americanon, Pulitzer Prize winner and New York Times best-selling author Jake Halpern says, "In an increasingly divided nation, it seems reasonable to ask, what is the glue that holds us together? It may be found here in these bound pages." Jess McHugh has written an elegant, meticulously researched, and eminently readable history of the books that define us as Americans. For history buffs and book lovers alike, McHugh offers us a precious gift and reminds that our many narratives are intertwined and that despite it all, they still bind us together. And we are very pleased to have the esteemed writer and researcher with us today. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks for having me.
The interesting thing about your book is you realize that self-help or refinement books have been part of American history almost from the very beginning.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, as early as the 18th century, you have Americans really thinking about how do I improve myself? How do I improve my station in life? And that's something that continues to this day.
Jess, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Come to Light West Coast IPA from the Jester King Brewery of Austin, Texas. Come to Light is the brewery's 2021 Pink Boots Society beer. Now, the Pink Boots Society was created to assist, inspire, and encourage women fermented and alcoholic beverage industry professionals, and to advance their careers through education. The group today is made up of many female movers and shakers in the industry. If you find yourself deep in the heart of Texas, make your way over to the Jester King Brewery and enjoy a Come to Light West Coast IPA for yourself. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Subscribing is the only way to get those newest episodes right away. I would also like to thank the many listeners from around the globe, 1,000 cities and over 70 countries. And now, I raise my Come to Light West Coast IPA very high. And to all of those, especially our guests, who have inspired and motivated through the written word, I say cheers. So the Old Farmer's Almanac, of course, is part of the book. It was published and has been published continuously since 1792. It makes it the oldest periodical of its nature in North America. And of course, it provides interesting advice on all kinds of information. How has it lasted so long? We're not in a circumstance where 90% of the people are living in rural areas or farmers.
That's a great question. And I've thought about it a lot because I grew up with the Almanac myself, and I was so surprised to learn that it sells something like 3 million copies a year, which is really quite staggering when you think about it. By comparison, I think, the New York Times has a circulation of maybe 500,000 print copies a year. I think really what it is it's about a certain nostalgia that we have for rural life. And so even people who live in cities or suburbs, maybe people who don't even have gardens, this is a way of having a window into kind of this imagined, idealized, agricultural American life. And it encourages also this observation of nature. So, even if you don't have a small farm, even if you don't have a garden, you can watch out for bird migration. You can look out for the eclipses. And I think this is something that brings peace and joy to people throughout history. And it's part of why I think it's lasted to this day.
If you look at American history, the first census where more people lived in cities or urban areas was 1920. And of course, the 20s, there was a serious spasm, similar to what we might be experiencing today because of the societal changes and shifts. And I think there is those who like to hearken back to those times, and they do pick up the Farmer's Almanac.
Definitely. And it's a good point because the Almanac itself went through a bit of a resurgence a little bit later. In the 1930s is when it really took off again, because it started in as you said, 1792, but it really saw this boom in the Depression years and then through World War II and post-World War II, when people are grappling with kind of the chaos of American life. And one way to return to some vision of peace is through this idea of the small farmer. Maybe you're planting your victory garden, or maybe you're just reading about it. But again, there's something kind of reassuring about that.
I'm going to talk about the dictionary next, but I live in a rural area mainly. I live on the Mississippi River at a town of about 50,000 or so, 40 or 50,000. But all around us are all these farming communities. And my grandfather was a farmer. And so I'm very used to that, the Farmer's Almanac on the counter or something like that. So it's part of my life as well. Now, in your book, you do focus a lot on the dictionary. It almost seems like it might have been important to your life.
Yes, I am fascinated by the dictionary. The dictionary was sort of how this whole book came about, in that I remembered hearing this kind of offhand comment in a lecture that someone saying, oh, Noah Webster was a nationalist. And I didn't think about it for years and years. And then during the 2016 election and following that, I noticed that Merriam-Webster's Twitter presence was really quite political, and they were, fact-checking politicians, and they seemed, to me anyway, they seemed sort of left-wing. And I remember thinking, oh, I wonder if that's true. What would this founding author of the dictionary make of this? And I kind of embarked on this journey to discover Noah Webster's history. And I was surprised to learn that he was indeed a nationalist, not in the sense of nationalism now, more in the sense of exalting one nation above all others. He would have been kind of a fan of the America First type of idea, this idea that America was going to be a new experiment. And so I was just so surprised to learn that he really did think the dictionary would found a linguistic independence, much as the Declaration of Independence had founded a, governmental independence. And that idea just blew my mind.
And there's real examples of that. He changes the nature of how many of the words are spelled. So today, when we look, say, at something on the internet from England and it's just spelled a little bit differently, that can be attributed back to Noah Webster.
Exactly. Yes. His idea was that we need to write English the way that educated Americans speak. And his vision was that American English would eventually be as different from British English as, say, German was from Dutch or Swedish. And we haven't quite gotten there, but he certainly did achieve a lot in terms of that goal. It was the spellings. It was also, he added tons and tons of words that had never been put into a dictionary before. He invented the word Americanized, for instance. And he also, instead of he did use some examples from Shakespeare, but he also used a lot of usage examples from Benjamin Franklin and Washington Irving, saying, look, we might be a young nation, but we already have this tradition of literature. And that to him was hugely important in terms of a nation's glory.
So what's he like as a person? When you did your research, what did you discover about Noah Webster as a man?
Well, one of the dictionary editors today said he described him as a bit of a wonk or a crank. He was not very popular. Seems like he was difficult to be around. His fellow Federalists nicknamed him a monarch because he was so bossy. And he just was a strange man. I mean, he was obsessed with his work to the point that he felt his children and his wife were distracting him and all the sounds of daily life were driving him nuts, and that he filled the walls of his study with sand, for instance. He was certainly an unusual man, but he did have a lot of powerful friends. He was, friendly with George Washington. He was invited to the White House for lunch. He got the loan for his newspaper from Alexander Hamilton. He considered Benjamin Franklin one of his mentors. So he is at once kind of an outsider and an insider, which I think is an interesting combination.
So as that book has changed over the years, obviously you can still purchase that, just like the Farmer's Almanac. How is it different from its original incarnation?
Well, it's changed a lot. I would say the main debate in dictionaries generally is, do we want to be prescriptivist? Do we want to tell people how to speak? Or do we want to be descriptivist? Do we want to describe how people speak? And I think they've gone from being prescriptivist, which arguably I think Webster was to a certain extent, to being much more descriptivist. You see in the 60s, they include the word ain't, which draws a ton of ire from some of the more academic folks at the time. And today, every year, the dictionary adds in new words, including internet slang. And so it's really, really, I would say almost a 180 from the original 1828 dictionary.
Now, the nuns that taught me in grade school would not have preferred the word ain't it whatsoever. So
yeah, a lot of people didn't like it at the time. It was scandalous. They had the word leggy. It was quite a moment.
When you look at the books you chose to be a part of that final 13, you decided not to use literary work, say from Twain or Hemingway or Steinbeck. You decide instead on bestsellers that have a more practical application. It's self-help and refinement, providing advice maybe. Why did you decide on those types of books to reveal American identity as opposed to some of the works from American literary giants?
So I love literary works. I studied comparative literature, and I love talking about great books and their effect on culture and history and just the text themselves. But when wanting to look at canon more broadly as kind of a shaper of culture, it forced me to look at the books that people were buying and consuming and using the most, and especially pre kind of 20th century and the boom in cheap printing presses. Overwhelmingly, the books that average working class, middle class Americans owned were not great novels. They were these kind of more what I call commonplace or daily books, like an almanac. The dictionary was a book that was quite expensive, so that was not a book everybody owned, but they would have had, a speller, a cookbook maybe, depending on whether we're talking 18th, 19th century and people's station in life. But that's what fascinated me was if you can only afford 3 or 5 books in 1850 or 1950, what are those books teaching you about what it means to be an American? And that's why I kind of gravitated toward these how-to books and also toward these books that were huge bestsellers, often in the kind of tens of millions range.
So not to belabor the discussion on the dictionary, but I'm wondering, is there any modern practical use of the original dictionary, the very first one?
Yes, it's actually kind of a fascinating question because the original dictionary is out of print, but a Bible Society fully digitized the entire thing because one of Noah Webster's main motivating factors was that he was a born-again Christian. He had had this experience where he says he met God in his study, which was not uncommon for the time. It was the Second Great Awakening. But the
whole religions have been founded that way.
I know, right? Yeah, Mormonism was right on his tail.
Sure, yes.
So the dictionary has a lot of Christian overtones. I mean, for instance, he has 13 definitions for the word love, and almost all of them have biblical citations in it. And so a lot of Christian homeschoolers have tried to find versions of the 1828 dictionary, and they've even gone so far as to ask Merriam-Webster to reprint it so that they can homeschool their children with it, which I was kind of astonished to learn. But yes, you can find the entire thing digitized online by this Bible Society, and it was hugely useful in my research because it's kind of hard to find otherwise.
So you include the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Of course, he's fascinating, just the character of Franklin. Mm-hmm. But did you choose it because of his history as an American or even self-proclaimed self-made man. And since that's the nature of these books that you've chosen, that it was important to choose someone like Franklin, who personified, at least at the time, an American self-made man.
Yes, exactly. I think it's hard to talk about an American canon without talking about Benjamin Franklin. He was, some people have called him the first American in some ways. And for me, partially it was the numbers. It's one of the best-selling, if not the best-selling autobiography of all time. And it was reprinted, dozens of times over the course of, less than a century. So it really was one of the few bestsellers in early America, which was part of my focus on kind of keeping this a data-driven book. At the same time, as you say, he was, and his book is, I think, the first rags to riches story in America. And it becomes the foundation for so many people who come after him, and also for so many books that come after him. I mean, so much of self-help, I think, is in many ways based on some of the concepts that Franklin introduces, the idea that you can better yourself by small daily changes, that you can track your progress, that there are certain virtues to follow. These are all Franklin ideas.
That was important to Washington, too. Not that Emily Post would have been part of his reading if that was available, but self-help and refinement definitely was.
Definitely.
But Franklin really is the first American that's known outside of, at that time, colonial America. And he goes to France, and I think you live in France now.
I do. I live in Paris.
That's pretty amazing. So are the remnants of that still available? Is that still part of French history? Do they still recognize Franklin's importance, at least in that era of their history?
Yes, definitely. It's funny, actually. I was walking to meet up with a friend, and I saw this huge Franklin statue in the middle of Paris, and I was like, he is and still here. They call him Franklin. And yeah, I love to kind of touch on the history briefly. I love when he first comes to Paris, which is he's trying to convince the French king to help bankroll the Revolutionary War. And he knows he's not going to go toe-to-toe with these aristocrats on their aristocratic terms. So he's wearing this, I think it's a marten fur hat, and he's got the spectacles and this kind of Quaker dress. And they're so charmed because this is exactly how they imagine Americans, as these kind of quirky frontiersmen. And they just adore him. And, his face is everywhere. He's on snuff boxes. Women buy these wigs to look like his hat. It's just incredible. And to this day, he's still one of those figures in American history that the French like, because he represents the things that they imagine, or that we imagine are best about America, and that I think they will begrudgingly admit are interesting about America, which is that he was this sort of Renaissance man. And they loved that, the fact that he was a scientist, but he was also interested in writing. And he also, was interested in building a fire brigade. He also loved a good party. He loved to flirt. And these are things that are important to the French.
Yeah, there's no question he liked that. That's, but he was in a costume, really. He realized that the environment that he was in. He's an amazing person in our history, so there's no question about that. Now, moving on to the McGuffey readers. Of course, I think there was 6 of them, if I think of that right.
Yes.
Is it overstating it to say that those readers spurred on a mass education or mass literate society for the first time in American history?
I don't think it is overstating it, because these are, a set of school primers that guided kids from learning the alphabet all the way through to high school. They sold something like 130 million copies, and each copy was often shared by multiple kids. So 130 is probably quite a moderate estimate of how many people read it. And to this day, 2021, those books have taught more Americans how to read than any other book in history, which is just staggering. And so, the common school movement was already on its way. And I think people were looking for what is going to be a book that is going to educate Americans. But I think what McGuffey did particularly well was that he kind of defined a sort of civic religion of what American children should learn about what are good values to have, how to be a good citizen, while also learning how to read. And I think they just spread like wildfire, especially in the Midwest and down toward the South a little bit later.
I'm from Illinois, so I'm right in the Midwest here, and I have to mention Abraham Lincoln. When I look at his personal education, when he's a boy, he only has access to a few books. Robinson Crusoe, and of course the Bible, and others like the New Guide to the English Tongue. I think he had that as part of his collection, and then an arithmetic book as well. But what he did was he read those over and over again. So just a small library, but reading it over and over again. And he develops a serious command of the language. I'm wondering, do we dismiss that, the fact that you can gain so much from so little, such a small library, if you're a master of those books?
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. And it also kind of notes the way in which 19th century education was often about memorization. So we might read 20 books in a month, say now, but how much are we retaining from each one? Because we're not reading it again and again. And then it also elevates the books that they were reading, because if you're memorizing a book, in my opinion, it's becoming ostensibly, especially if you're a young person, a child, it might become part of your moral compass, part of the way that you understand the world. If this is one of the few lenses that you have to understand that which is around you. And I think that that's what books often are, is a lens. And so McGuffey himself was quite similar to Lincoln in that way, where his education was quite sparse. His mother taught him the alphabet by tracing letters in sort of their fireplace. He memorized passages from the Bible. He had some formal schooling, but, living in a log cabin in what was then the frontier of Ohio, you don't have a lot of options. So you really do. It's about wanting to be educated and finding it where you can, which I think is so admirable.
Well, I think you're right. It's about wanting to be educated, wanting to be better, take yourself to a better place than you're currently in. And when you're out there on the frontier, like McGuffey or Lincoln, there's a real desire and ambition that molds you. And that's why a man like Lincoln can write something like the Second Inaugural or the Gettysburg Address. He has a better command of language than someone who might have went to Harvard.
Yeah, exactly. It makes me think of Frederick Douglass, too.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Who's educated with a very limited number of books and is able to become one of the best orators of the 19th century. I mean, it's incredible.
So if we move forward, and I mentioned her already, Emily Post and her book, Etiquette, and of course the title is longer than that. I'm looking at these books and I kind of place it into its historical context. What's going on in society that makes that specific book so popular? So what's going on in the 1920s? What does it say about society that Emily Post's Etiquette becomes a bestseller?
Sure. So there's a couple things. I think her publishers were a little bit surprised because people said they weren't necessarily calling it the Roaring Twenties at that point, but people said, it's modern life. Who's going to want to buy a book about etiquette? We've got flappers, we've got people drinking gin. And Emily Post says, no, there's always going to be people who want to make their lives better, who want to kind of rise up through the ranks of business or society or politics, and they need to know the rules. So that was part of it, was, I think, her attempting to contain a little bit the chaos that was the 1920s. And she's, of course, coming from this very, very upper class background. And amongst her peers, there was this fear that without manners, we're animals. And as people are kind of shucking off these old traditions in the 1920s, there's a risk. And I think the other thing that's happening, of course, is the continuing fallout from World War I. So her book comes out in 1922, which is only just a few years after the end of World War I. And you have people also reckoning with that particular brand of chaos. You have all of the writers of the lost generation. And in some sense, I think she's responding to those same questions that they were, even though the answers she comes up with are quite different. So yeah, I think it's a combination of a lot of different societal factors.
If we're looking at self-help, the appeal of self-help and refinement, and since we're talking about the 20s, you take someone, let's say from the 1920s, maybe just off of the farm, from a working class family, they move to a city like New York or Chicago, and some of these people, just through their hard work and ambition, move from that lower social class and status, and they get invited to some of these parties or high-class events where etiquette is extremely important. If you're someone like a Carnegie, not Dale Carnegie, but
good clarification.
All right, or Rockefeller, and you're one of those family names and you make a mistake in that situation, it's forgiven. But if you're someone who's trying very hard and you get into those parties, one mistake could end your influence.
Yes, exactly. That's a great point. And I think that's just it, is that people who already are on the inside are learning these things from their mothers or their governesses or what have you. And they have a much greater kind of bandwidth of leeway because they're already in. They can't be kicked out. But for the people who are trying to get in, even a tiny mistake is enough to say, no, you're not one of us. I often think of someone like, the character of The Great Gatsby. I can picture him memorizing the hundreds of rules in Emily Post's Etiquette to pass, so to speak, as someone who is, really pretending at the ease that these rich people have naturally. And, Fitzgerald was fascinated by Emily Post's book and said he wanted to write a play based on it. And I think that just speaks to how much manners can be a tool of exclusion or inclusion, even in a society such as the United States, where we don't like to think that we have social class, perhaps.
Oh, Virginia, how nice to see you. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all. I'm reading letters as usual. Are there any new questions? A few. But it's always so interesting as to why there are so many questions about table manners. Well, that's easy to understand, because most people are at ease in their own homes, but often are confused at a dinner party. That's true, and yet, manners at the most formal dinner party are exactly the same as they are at home.
So I did mention Dale Carnegie, and he publishes his book on how to win friends and influence people, and that has sold throughout the decades. Why do some of these books just have republications and reprints, even though, it was printed decades ago?
Yes, that one does surprise me, and I've had trouble figuring it out exactly because it's a book that comes out in 1936, and it's ostensibly about grappling with the lack of employment opportunities, I would argue, in the post-Depression era. And it's kind of about surviving and, getting a job, keeping a job. And in so many ways, the work landscape has shifted so much since then, just in terms of the fact that fewer people are working for these large corporations, more people are freelance, or, even just the profile of the worker, the American worker, has changed so much. I think what continues to resonate is what resonates about so many self-help books and so many of these how-to books. And it's the idea that with just a few tips, whether it's smiling or remembering people's names, that you can be more successful. You can be more, you can earn more money. And a big part of Carnegie's beliefs was you can be more liked. And I think this is huge. And when we think about American success, it's so important to us not just to be successful in the economic terms, but to be popular, to be approved of, and to be liked. And Carnegie is really thinking about that.
You want the approval of those with whom you come in contact. You want recognition of your true worth. You want a feeling that you are important in your little world. You don't want to listen to cheap, insincere flattery, but you do crave sincere appreciation. You want your friends and associates to be, as Charles Schwab puts it, hearty in their approbation and lavish in their praise. All of us want that. So let's obey the golden rule and give unto others what we would have others give unto us. I once succumbed to the fad of fasting and went 6 days and nights without eating anything whatever. It wasn't difficult. I was less hungry at the end of the 6th day than I was at the end of the 2nd. Yet I know people who would think that they had committed a crime if they let their families or employees go for 6 days without food. But they will let them go for 6 days and 6 weeks, and sometimes 60 years, without giving them the hearty appreciation, the recognition, the sincere praise that they crave as much as they crave food. Reading this won't do you any good unless you apply it.
This was written before World War II, but after World War II, the society changes and there's this movement to the suburbs and this professional nature you see in shows like Mad Men, for example. And if you don't employ some of these ideas, you're not going to get ahead. You have to do these things, similar to what Emily Post was saying, but decades later and in a different environment. But if you don't do certain things, if you don't have, like Don Draper and have an old-fashioned at 1 p.m, you could be left out, and then you don't close the deal. You don't get the promotion. That becomes really important.
Yes, that's right on the nose. And I think a lot of people have credited exactly that period to the kind of growing success of that book, because it really took off in the 50s and in the 60s. You see tons of people taking Dale Carnegie seminars, and a lot of it was just that. It was this move to the suburbs, people working in these corporate environments where they need to know how to act at a cocktail party or how to meet, the manager's wife. And books like this one are very useful for that.
There's a book that I always enjoyed. It's called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I know the movie, but not the book.
So many of those men are 20 years old. They're liberating countries and so forth, and it's important. And then they get on these trains and they're riding into these jobs, and they may be reading things like Dale Carnegie, and they look around them and they're thinking, the most important thing I ever did when I was 20 years old. That just always resonated with me. I spent 27 years in the Army. So what's it like for a person when you think the most important thing I ever did, I did when I was 20?
Right. Yeah, I can't imagine. And I think that is part of what can be a little bit stifling about some of the books in this collection, including Carnegie. And, kind of I think in some ways the counterpart for women was Betty Crocker's picture cookbook. It's this vision of conformity and uniformity, and you're going to take the train to work. You're going to take the train back to your suburb. Your wife is going to make you dinner. And there's something that can feel a little bit suffocating about that.
Well, since you brought up Betty Crocker's picture cookbook, she's not even a real person.
No. A lot of people were surprised to learn this, as was I, because I grew up with the Fanny Farmer cookbook, who I think was a real person, but I could be wrong about that. But yes, so she's not a real person. They had this, what would become General Mills at the time was the Washburn Crosby Milling Company, had an advertisement for their signature product, gold medal flour. And they said, if you complete this puzzle, you can send it in and we'll send you a pincushion. And they were surprised that all of these women also sent in questions about, why is my dough lumpy? Why won't my cakes rise? And the all-male ad man team, who I picture kind of like Mad Men, don't know what to do with this at all. So they have this informal contest among their secretaries, and they invent this name, Betty, because they think it sounds wholesome, Crocker for an executive who just retired. And they write these letters and they have their secretary sign. And then as radio takes over in the 1920s, they get a bunch of Betty Crocker actresses, and she just becomes a huge celebrity. I mean, she's getting 4,000 to 5,000 letters per day at her height in the 1940s, which is more than some of the Hollywood actresses were getting. And she guides women through the war. So by the time the cookbook comes out in 1950, she is a national sensation. And it just flies off the shelves. I think it's sold something like 75 million copies since 1950.
Not that men are that much better today, but the men of the 1950s, it's just amazing to me. Let's not get an actual cook, an actual woman. Let's create one. Let's just
What are we going to do? Yeah, I can picture them all running around the room like, we didn't see this coming.
You also include Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask. That was published in 1969, and of course there was a lot going on in society at that time as well. But when you have books like that, what does it say about how we fall so significantly short in sex education? It just seems like the popularity of it shows that as a society we're falling short.
Yes, definitely. And I mean, there were so many best-selling sex books in the 60s, I think, because there was such a dearth of publicly available information about sex. And the issue was that the books that were the most popular, including this one, were not very accurate. I mean, he says that Coca-Cola is a good vaginal douche. He has all of these tips that are just wildly untrue. And I think what also surprised me and kind of disappointed me about the book was my main reference point was the Woody Allen movie. And so I thought the book would be kind of similarly quirky and weird, but it's very conservative and very kind of shaming of a lot of different groups of people. So he says, white people shouldn't have sex with Black people because Black people have more venereal diseases. And this is something that we need to worry about. He really calls all gay and lesbian people basically animals. And we're getting into the 70s now almost. We're not talking about the turn of the 20th century. And this is one of the best, if not the best-selling sex book of all time. And it's really excluding so many groups of people. And I guess my last thought on that too is that it speaks to the ways in which sex books are often about so much more than just the act of sex. They're about who's included, who should be ashamed, what kind of people do we want to populate our marriages and our American families, so to speak.
I mean, that sounds somewhat insidious.
Yeah, just a tad.
Yeah, but it seems as if they want the right people to copulate with the other right people. That is kind of a gross thing to think about.
Yeah, definitely. And the roots of sex advice in America really come very directly out of the eugenics movement. So, some of the first sex manuals in the States come out in the teens and the 20s, and they're all about marriage between the right kinds of people. So they call it positive eugenics. If negative eugenics is sterilizing people, positive eugenics is encouraging the right kinds of people to mate. And that really was how so much of this literature was born initially.
Does that book still sell today?
Not that I can tell, not in any big numbers. The first edition was quite hard to find. He did a rewrite of it in the 90s. But no, I think there's just so much sex advice available on the internet that I think fewer people are buying that particular book.
In all kinds of versions, yes.
Oh, yes.
So what are some of the books that almost made your list? I'm sure you've been asked this several times. You only included 13. So there must have been many that you wanted to include and you just left off the list.
Yes. So it took years to decide on the final list. And I tried to focus as much as I could on the data to avoid personal or regional bias. But there were some books that were on and then I took off. One was Carl Sagan's Cosmos, because it was a huge bestseller, but and it was in some ways a didactic book. But in the end, I didn't feel like it was really a how-to book in the same way that the other ones were. The other one that I took off at the last minute was The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous by Bill Wilson, because that sold upwards of 30 million copies. And it's a fascinating book in its own right, because it comes out in, I want to say 39, but AA had started earlier, I think in the early 30s. And in many ways, similar to Dale Carnegie, it's responding to the Depression. It's also responding to a lot of people who were suffering with alcoholism because of trauma from World War I. And it's what I've liked about that book is that unlike a lot of these other books that are focused on how can the individual solve the individual's problems, the big book is about how can we as a collective solve our collective problems. And I found something quite poignant and transcendent about that even.
Well, not to weaken that discussion, but it is also an episode in the Seinfeld series.
Is it?
There's an episode on Alcoholics Anonymous, and actually James Spader is featured in that.
Is this the one where Elaine is dating an alcoholic and by accident they switch drinks?
I'm not sure, but it's one where George is expecting an apology, and there's a step that's making amends, and he doesn't get an apology. So
yes, I love this. And then they have the whole discussion about what is off the wagon or on the wagon. I love this show.
So guess who called me last night? Jason Hankey.
Stanky Hanky? What did he want?
He called to apologize for standing me up 5 years ago.
Why now?
AA. It's one of the 12 steps. Step number 9 is you have to apologize to everyone you've ever wronged.
Oh, I can't wait for Hanky to come crawling back to me.
Still with the neck hole?
Still upset. Very upset.
What neck hole?
Remember that New Year's party he threw a few years ago? He had that very drafty apartment, I think on 9th Avenue.
Pastor?
I asked if I could borrow a sweater.
A cashmere sweater.
I said preferably cashmere for warmth. So in front of the whole party, he says, no, I don't want you stretching out the neck hole. Oh, yeah, sure, laugh it up. Everybody else did.
Oh, it's funny. I mean, you have a big head. Or is it because of your neck?
No, I think the head does most of the stretching.
Regardless, I had to walk around for the rest of the party in some cheap MetLife windbreaker. Now it is payback time.
Guys, there's no doubt that the pay is good, but I just don't know if I see myself working with ice cream.
You get pretty buff forearms.
I don't know if I'm into that.
Oh, hello, Hanky. Others?
George.
You know, Jason, I couldn't help notice. I didn't get my apology.
Apology for what?
A drafty apartment, a sweaterless friend, a ball game giveaway, MetLife windbreaker.
George, come on, not that neck hole thing.
Yeah, the neck hole thing, and I would appreciate it if you would say you're sorry.
No way, you would have completely stretched it out.
You're an alcoholic! You have to apologize! Step 9! Step 9!
All right, George, all right, I'm sorry. I'm very, very sorry. I'm so sorry that I didn't want your rather bulbous head struggling to find its way through the normal-sized neck hole of my finely knit sweater.
So what are some modern books, then, that you felt that you needed to include? I think you include The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Yes. So the final chapter is about kind of the, broadly speaking, self-help movement in the 80s and the 90s. I think it sort of branches off into the sort of business management books as exemplified by 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And on the other end, you kind of see a lot of new age books. So I chose You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay, but there are a lot of other kind of similar books. And I think both are responding to, again, the insecurities of their time in terms of, you know, some of the erosion of the social safety net and mass layoffs and people feeling like, how do I take my destiny, so to speak, under my own control?
You know, the kind of potential. It's all bundled up in there. It's latent. I mean, this match could burn down the building that you're in if it's put in the right spot. Or if it were totally dark, it could give light to hundreds of people. That's the power, the potential in a single match. That is also the power and the potential in a single person.
So as you're doing your research, did you come across some of these books that were not as positive, say as Stephen Covey or something like that, but were more Machiavellian, that you have to dominate people or be in control of people? Did you encounter that in any way?
Yes. There's a couple that were really popular in the 80s, and now I can't remember the author's name, but he wrote 2 books that are basically this. One was called Winning Through Intimidation, and the other one was called Looking Out for Number One. And it was basically this idea that in order to succeed, you need to crush others.
Yes.
So there certainly was that, especially you kind of think about the Wolf of Wall Street sort of poster child of perhaps this strain of self-help, so to speak. But in general, self-help in America tends to be much more optimistic, even if there is a dark side to it, which is that not everybody's going to succeed, whether or not they buy these books. And, you know, there might be factors outside of your control, such as, you know, generational poverty or systemic racism that might affect your chances of success. But the language of American self-help tends to be much more aspirational and positive.
The last thing I'd like to talk to you about, I'm going to give you a couple examples and see what you think that did not get included in the original 13 that you have. But if you have a reprint in the future, an extended version, you let me know what you think about these 2. And they're completely different pieces of writing.
Ooh, I'm excited.
One is Thomas Payne's Common Sense, which of course isn't a book, it's just a pamphlet. And the other one is Action Comic #1, When Superman comes onto the stage.
I love both of these. So it's funny. The Thomas Payne one is great. I mean, I had thought about including the Federalist Papers at one point. Common sense is so foundational to early American thinking and the American Renaissance, so to speak. So I think that's a great one.
And so widely read.
And super widely read.
Or at least so widely digested, I guess.
Yes, and it was widely read because like a few pamphlets, I should say, the Federalist Papers and you know, a few, and even the Declaration of Independence, it was reprinted in so many places, including in almanacs and in newspapers. So it was really made available to the public in a way that not everything was. And I also, the comic I love because I think, this is another idea I've had, I really think you can track American anxieties about different things through comic books and comic book villains in particular. Like you see the way that the foreign mood or the mood towards foreign policy changes just by watching, who is Superman fighting? Who is James Bond going against? I know not a comic book, but I think that's a great one.
Well, I really appreciate it. Really fun to talk to you today.
You too.
What are you working on now? What's your next research? Where does it lead you to?
I am not quite sure. I'm figuring it out. I had a feature come out yesterday that I was excited about wild Mustangs and the preservation of wild Mustangs. And actually, as a veteran, this might be interesting. It's about a farm in upstate New York that pairs combat veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who are struggling with post-traumatic stress with wild Mustangs. And it's a therapeutic program, and they find that in kind of gentling these Mustangs, they're able to ease a lot of their own kind of symptoms of hypervigilance. And it's just a fascinating program because it helps both the veterans and the horses. So I wrote about that for The Guardian, and I was pleased with how that turned out. And it also speaks to a lot of the stories that we tell about Mustangs, or stories about our understanding of ourselves as Americans, and they're kind of a idealized American in animal form almost.
I can definitely see that. I want to commend you for that as well, because veteran suicide is an epidemic. I mean, it's a serious problem.
I know. Yeah. And that's something that this organization I worked with, they're called Equicenter, that talks a lot about, and they have an annual, they call it Hoof It for Heroes. And it's a race that people can run all over the world to raise money and raise awareness around veteran suicide, because it's just such a problem.
Yes, it definitely is. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, that was great. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
I would like to thank my guest once again today, writer and researcher Jess McHugh. And if you would like to get her book, Americanon, An Unexpected U.S. History in 13 Best-Selling Books, simply click on the link in the description below. Of Americanon, the Christian Science Monitor writes, "This delightful book argues that enduring bestsellers, including The Old Farmer's Almanac and How to Win Friends and Influence People, have contributed to a unified national identity as much as revered founding documents like the Constitution." Our featured brew was Come to Light West Coast IPA from the Jester King Brewery of Austin, Texas. If you enjoyed our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. For more information on our featured books and authors, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to know what they have going on, just click on their link. It's in the description below as well. And finally, to all of the listeners and supporters from over 1,000 cities and over 70 countries, I have to say, once again, thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Oh, hi, I'm Troy McClure. You might remember me from such self-help videos as Smoke Yourself Thin and Get Confident, Stupid. Well, now I'm here to tell you about the only real path to mental health. That's right, it's the Brad Goodman something or other.
Marge, can I go outside and play?
Shh. A few weeks ago, I was a washed-up actor with a drinking problem. Then Brad Goodman came along and gave me this job and a can of fortified wine. Ah, sweet liquor eases the pain. And now I'd like to introduce the man who will put the U in improvement. Brad Goodman!
Thank you so much, Troy. And by the way, I'm not happy you're still drinking. But at least you're down to 1 from more than 50. Folks, I'm often asked about my qualifications. Well, I may not have a lot of credentials or training, but I tell you one thing. I'm a PhD in Payne. Now let me show you how you can change your life. Troy, this circle is you.
My God, it's like you've known me all my life. Doctor, you've solved all my problems.